Hello, Edie.
Hey, Michael, I'm testing my mic here.
I can hear you.
Awesome sauce.
How are you, dear?
I'm wonderful. I just spent a long weekend in New Orleans.
Sounds great. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. I'm just going to kind of set the stage here because we don't have an opportunity to have Julie from Consuli on board with us today. So we're kind of managing on our own, but it's okay because I think we've put together a very good panel. And we're going to have, I'm sure, some people who are joining from the audience who would like to come up and speak. And, I think we'll be able to get the next hour done in good shape here. We've got 18, 19 people who are signed up here and 12 on the call right now. So I think Sophie and Edie and Scott, if you're ready to start out, we will, as co-mods, we're in favor. Okay. So let me just simply start by making sure. I think we've got a couple. Well, we have one newbie down here at the bottom, Caitlin. So I just want to make sure that people know that they can use the share button at the bottom of the screen to share this room on social media or directly with others. And you certainly are encouraged to chime in. If you have something to say, just simply raise your hand and we'll get you moved up onto the podium here. Um, we're trying to follow each other on this conversation in here, and we are really rounding out a series of conversations that we've had around this topic of J.E.D.I, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So today we're going to be focusing on inclusion, and I think over the last 4 months, we've established that, in the face of our J.E.D.I objectives to try and improve clinical trials overall, that our current clinical trial model really does not achieve the inclusion of all affected populations in the enrollment, development, and design of clinical trials. So not unlike some of the deficiencies that we found in terms of justice and equity and diversity, inclusion is one of those very important breadth of recruitment that needs to happen here. So I took a shot at trying to, kind of define inclusion as focusing on involving everyone and making sure no one is excluded from enrolling in a clinical trial for reasons of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or any disability that they might have, or anything else that really makes them different. Obviously, if they don't meet the inclusion or exclusion criteria, just like anyone else, they wouldn't be able to participate. But I think there's a real mandate to try and reach out and make clinical trials much more inclusive. It's simply not about just including diverse groups, but making sure that all of these people who do seek to enroll feel integral, they're able to participate in decision making, development opportunities, and activities and policies that might affect them. So today's one burning question is really, what are some methods you have or will employ to achieve inclusion in both for both patients who are enrolled and the sites and companies involved in research? Because I think that the inclusion question or quandary goes much broader. So I'll stop speaking there for a moment here and pass this over to Edie to have her add her comments here in the beginning and introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Michael. Really appreciate it. Love the intro. For those of you who might not have met me before, this is Edie Edens, and I work specifically in the research compliance space as a licensed attorney and professional research ethicist. My practice is primarily in the United States, although for some clients, wink, wink, nod, nod, Cardiff, Lucia, I gladly work outside of the confines of the United States. And I work almost always with first class solutions, although admittedly I've been brought in on other projects with other companies. So this has been a really fun series and journey with this group, frankly, who I just adore and can't say enough about in terms of navigating the J.E.D.I concepts. Like coming from last spring where we were talking about, I just want to bring this full picture for everyone and for anyone who hasn't followed the journey, kind of update you. This is a part of a bigger series. We saw last spring, of course, the FDA released guidance on expectations for diversity in clinical trials and what those plans needed to look like. But of course, the FDA, as always, releases a proposed document first, or guidance or regulation. It allows for commentary and then takes that into account and finalizes and implements. And so we're still very much in that process. This group used a crowdsourced list of comments to actually comment on that FDA publication. And then that launched into this wonderful series on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So this is really a huge, long journey that this group has been on. So take a moment, take that in. As it relates to when we're talking about the specific question this week, it's interesting. A lot of you know I also have the privilege of being adjunct faculty at one of Indiana University's School of Law. The one, I always just tell people, it's the one with the health law. It's the one that shares a parking lot with the med school. It's in Indianapolis. And I teach some doctrinal classes in terms of what I do for a living, but I also have the unique opportunity to work with students in experiential learning opportunities who are coming into their own in health law. And as a part of that role, we've been working really hard at IU throughout the various schools and departments to work better on these topics, as I'm sure a lot of you are seeing in your organizations, respectfully, whatever kinds of organizations they might be. And so it was just this week that they had this phenomenal lecture. And this is someone when I was in-house at IU, I actually called upon to come do lectures to my staff on these types of topics, who came in, and what they did and created was incredibly interesting. They first and foremost introduced the topic of inclusion with our students, right? And what we needed to think about as faculty. And I think it very much mimics what we're thinking about as being clinical research professionals and looking at patients, looking at each other, looking at sponsors, looking at stakeholders, looking at those who are new to our industry, et cetera, and how we achieve this full sense of inclusion like Michael was referring to. And this presenter first took essentially, kind of a vote, if you will, or a temperature of the room on what do we think of inclusion? How well do we think we're doing? Where do you think our greatest room for improvement is? Of course, a room full of lawyers, we couldn't help ourselves. And there were a couple nods to we're better than where we've been from faculty who frankly been there for a very long time. There were a couple of newer, more progressive faculty who were like, oh, we've only just begun. But there's a good temperature of the room. And then they did essentially what they'd come to do, which was instead of lecturing at us, they had taken a significant amount of time on the heels of the pandemic to seek out students on the campus of all different levels, all different backgrounds, all different academic goals, right? All different phases of their education and their career, and really sat down and had meaningful interviews that would almost qualify, in my opinion, as behavioral research, really, for a couple hours with each and every identified student, and had them answer, obviously, a standardized set of questions. And they asked permission and consented to film them. And then they put together this incredibly impactful video that they basically had us watch for the next half hour. And I've seen this guy present before. He's a phenomenal presenter. So I knew if he had a video, it wasn't because he was just, skirping out on having to talk. And this video from the lips of the individuals impacted was fire. And it gave me the idea to think through, because everyone on here knows I love education. I'm a huge nerd. How do we translate something like that actually reflects the experiences of the folks that we're trying to make feel that inclusion from their lips and make that impactful to the various stakeholders in our industry? And that's the idea I've brought to the table today, and I'm beginning to work on within my network and my firm. I don't have any concrete ideas just yet. I'd love to hear if others are doing it or would like to be a part of that movement. And then for now, I'm going to go ahead and pass this on so we can continue this great discussion. And I'm going to call on you, Kartik. Thanks so much. This is J.E.D.I.
Wonderful. Thanks, J.E.D.I. I love that example. To introduce myself a little bit to the group here, so my name is Kartik. I'm the VP of Business Transformation and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at LeapCure. And LeapCure is really focused, and its mission is to generate medical breakthroughs within clinical research that are for everyone with everyone. And I think that last statement, for everyone with everyone, really kind of captures a lot of these diversity, equity, inclusion concepts. For me, I think I work very closely with Edie, and I've met a lot of you through these discussions, and I've really enjoyed the journey as well. I think when it comes to inclusion, I've had previous experiences of really, especially with internal inclusion, right? Like, how are you supporting your employees through inclusive practices? A lot of previous companies I've worked with really kind of take almost the diversity metrics as metrics regarding inclusion. They'll say, oh, we brought in so many diverse candidates through the hiring pool. We've brought in so many diverse employees. We're doing a great job at inclusion. And they'll pat themselves on the back. And to me, that was always a fallacy, because if we looked at the rates that those employees were leaving or quitting, they didn't really support that narrative that inclusion is being upheld. And so I think there's a lot of work that we need to figure out. Michael, I loved your definition of inclusion. How do we think about inclusion both internally and within our stakeholders, right? And I think inclusion, like Edie mentioned, is dependent on a feeling, right? How comfortable do you feel? How supported do you feel? And how included do you feel in every step of the process? And I think that's such a personal journey, and therefore kind of every interaction, every space needs to think about inclusion in some way. So I think that's my big idea that I want, that I'm excited to chat more about here. And so would love to go around the room. I'll pass it over to Sophie here to introduce herself.
Thanks, Karthik. It's great to meet you, by the way. I've heard such
Yes,
wonderful
great to
things
meet
about
you.
you. Unfortunately haven't had a chance to work with you or speak with you yet, so I'm going to be listening very closely, very carefully, and I'm excited to hear your perspectives and your what you have to contribute to this conversation. Looking forward to more time with you in the future. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Sophie Johannin. I am a clinical scientist at a medical device company called Galvanized Therapeutics. Previously, I was at Boston Scientific, and I have overall almost 20 years experience in clinical trials at the site and sponsor level. And I have been everything from a clinical research coordinator to a monitor to a data manager, regulatory, clinical evaluation scientist, and now I'm helping to design protocols and collect that data and report out to regulatory bodies. So what I think about inclusion of everyone relevant to the clinical trial is that it has to start with the people who are designing, implementing, and operating the clinical trial, as well as the healthcare professionals and allied health staff who are carrying out the trial. So if we don't have diversity amongst clinical trial professionals at the sponsor level, CRO level, FDA, NIH, and at our hospitals, clinics, and research institutes that are carrying out these trials, then how can we expect the patient enrollment, to be inclusive? I think that's probably the first step. And the other thing is more specific education. I think it's really important to know who you're talking to, know your audience, and cater or tailor the education to that audience. So that's what I wanted to add now. And then a couple of housekeeping things. I see a couple of new people have joined. So for those who don't know, Clubhouse has a very particular way of working. If you want to join the stage, you have something to say or a question to ask, you can raise your hand. There is a hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can touch on that and ask to be brought up, like Io did that, and I brought him up here. so we can have a very informal conversation as we go around the room here. Normally, we go from left to right and top down to allow everyone to speak and have a chance to add their voice to this discussion. The other thing, a new feature of Clubhouse I wanted to let you know is the emotions. You might have noticed that I have been responding to Karthik and Edie and Michael's discussion so far with emotions. So if you touch and hold your profile, you'll see that a variety of emotions come up, and you can see that I've sent out a heart now. So you can do the same, and you can react to anyone's comments or questions, so that if you if you can't come up and speak, you can still respond and be part of the conversation. Excellent. So
And you
yeah,
can
just gonna,
also throw GIFs in there, Sophie.
there you go. You can change your identity completely. So, and then the other thing is we have a group chat. If you touch on the little comment bubble on the left bottom corner of your page, you can see the group chat, and you can see the comments that are being passed back and forth and be part of the conversation. So just like this topic, we want to include everyone and we want to hear every voice. So there are multiple ways of doing this. So with that, I would love to pass it on to Christine, who always has oodles and oodles to add to every topic. Go, Christine.
Probably too much to add to every topic. I'm Christine Van Rysveld. I'm a patient advocate, also run a small nonprofit. And, I had a whole thing about inclusion that I was going to talk about when we were planning this meeting. And, that was basically around inclusion of, I'm a minority, and in 2030, 80% of the American population is going to be mixed. And so I think our conversation around inclusion needs to also change there. But I was also just speaking at Reuters, and I wanted to comment on another side of it, is that at the topic or at the conference, there were so many people, other people on stage, right, who talk about inclusion and then immediately go into the ROI around the ways that they've included, and going straight from inclusion to profit. And so my idea of true inclusion isn't about making people feel a certain way. It's about actually including them, right? In the innovation, in the design, and in the profits, right? Because we all know how I feel about data being on disability. And so I think when we're thinking about inclusion, there's so many different ways to come at this. And even in a global perspective, right? When I have conversations in the US, inclusion is not including. And so, I don't know, I think we just really need to kind of define what we think is inclusion. And again, like, I think it's not about the feeling. I think it's actually being included. And sometimes that's not all about fuzzy feelings and, and being made to feel good about things, but actually being that partner in it. So I am going to leave it there. And I think it was Eric that was IO. I want to pass it to you, unless Sophie, you have something else you want to add.
No, please, let's go ahead
No,
to.
that's great. We'll go to IO and then we'll get Scott in here.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm a cancer patient who went through a clinical trial, and I was fortunate enough to qualify for it by virtue of having had my genome sequenced. So to folks listening, there's, at least some incentive to doing your homework, which notably could be the most important homework of your life, learning about your health. In the case of survivability, I guess that was kind of a challenge for me, jumping around from doctor to doctor before I finally had somebody listen. And so I asked the question now in trying to pay it forward. I work on sensor technology that hopefully will help us diagnose things a little bit sooner, give us something more than just a scalar, perhaps a spectrum of values to enable physicians. But my question is, to what extent could we enable patients before diagnosis and or after/during treatment to share their experiences or their data? And I know there would be a lot of HIPAA compliance type landmines to navigate there. But in terms of patient outcomes, there's been a lot of evidence to support the claims that survivability increases, so does quality of life when their family gets involved. I wonder to what extent, if we extend that social fabric to include their friends, families, and or other patients who are similarly going through this, those networks themselves may reinforce the health of the very patients we're trying to help. So that's just a question for me as an entrepreneur, as well as a patient now trying to pay it forward. Thanks.
I
Can
know
I
that's an
comment?
awesome question. It's an awesome question, and I think it's well worth discussing here. Let's put that up on the board and have Scott weigh in first and tell us a little bit about his perspective on inclusion.
Hey, great. Thanks, Michael, and thanks everybody. Love all the different comments and threads. I can see we may have a hard time kind of getting right to our one burning question because there are so many other pieces here that build in around it. But either way, a great discussion. I'm happy to be part of it. This is the fourth of the J.E.D.I series, right? And whether you think the Jedi from Star Wars lore is an appropriate symbol for justice, that remains to be seen. But this has been a great series to be part of, and I'm psyched to be here with you guys. So I'll keep my intro brief because there's some meaty discussions to be had, and the clock is ticking here, and we want to keep things moving. So my name is Scott Schliebner. I am a clinical development executive. I am a patient advocate. And I am somebody who is hyper-focused on the end users in clinical development, i.e. the patients whom we depend upon, their enrollment and their data for clinical development and new therapies to move forward. I began a career in biotech and ran a cancer nonprofit for a while, and I've developed some tools around trying to not so much related to diversity or inclusion or equity or justice, but actually moving a little further upstream to just get people thinking about patients to begin with, right? The idea that clinical trials and these protocols that we all love are developed often in a conference room in New Jersey, as we like to say, often are developed without, they're in a bubble without like end user inputs. So before we're even thinking about inclusion, we're trying to just get people to think, period, and start to realize there are human beings on the other end of this that we rely on. So let's make sure first off that we're even designing studies that are feasible and reasonable for families and children and caregivers and elderly and people who are already managing a disease. Once we can kind of get that conversation going with those who are designing and implementing these studies, then I feel like we can even jump into some more important topics like how do we make sure we've got equal access, and how are we being inclusive in these studies. You'll also see I'm usually the one here on our panel that is also saying, hey, let's not keep this conversation US specific. The far majority of clinical trials are global and multinational in nature, which means automatically, even though we have a US centric panel, we need to be thinking globally about people in other countries and how do definitions of diversity and equity and different healthcare systems kind of overlay a clinical trial that could take place in San Jose, California, but it could also take place in Madrid, Spain. So trying to always kind of think about that global nature because there are different things around. I heard a HIPAA reference. We've got some GDPR stuff to think about in Europe. We have 80, as Christine said, 80% of the United States will be of mixed race. Here's what does that look like in other countries, right? So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in seeing if we can move our conversation towards anything that might be remotely actionable. And with that, I will sign off and turn it over to, I think, Christine, you had a comment, but Michael, feel free to direct us where we should head next.
No, first of all, Christine, I'll come back to you in a second here, but clearly, I think this is a group discussion here, but I do want to reflect on something here. And one of the, if you will, catalysts for this J.E.D.I discussion series that we've put together was really as J.E.D.I alluded to in the beginning, was really the April FDA draft guidance. And I'm kind of curious, Scott, as you're traveling about the world and given your, your CRO experience, are you seeing other countries moving legislatively or from a clinical trial guidance standpoint in a similar direction? Are there other types of legislation that would help mandate, certainly at the sponsor level, to have some better quote unquote thinking about this?
Yeah, super important question. I think the short answer is no, I haven't, but I might be missing something and I might not be seeing some of the different, country specific, regs or legislation. But what I do see is I see really different, playing fields, right? I think the realities of whether it's our healthcare system, whether it's the United States being a really large country with all kinds of different geographic and ethnic diversity, we have a little bit of a different situation here, right? It's a little different than if you're in Belgium or if you're in Sweden. And sure, you're dealing with some other issues there, but I think what we have in the United States is very, very unique, right? And I think it's just important to remember we're trying to bring a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, who are often spread thousands of miles away from each other together into one kind of common solution. I think some of our European colleagues, and I mean, not to just focus it on Europe either, right? I mean, let's think about the folks to the south in Latin America as well, or in Africa, or in Southeast Asia. But if you just look at Europe, they're facing just a different makeup and demography of their citizens. They're not changing and evolving quite at the pace maybe we are in the United States. And they have different regulations, governmental structures, and healthcare all around that. So it's a really different conversation. So on one hand, I'm saying let's not forget about that, and let's make sure we think beyond our own country borders. At the same time, it's a big kind of thing to tackle, to sort of how do we think about almost country level or EU specific sort of solutions that can work not just here, but also over there.
100%, Scott. I couldn't agree with you more, especially thinking about the difference between, our population here in the US versus the populations in certain countries in EU, like you mentioned, Belgium. A lot of those countries have a more homogenous sort of population, and it's a lot more difficult to make sure multiple different races and ethnicities are included. And the other thing that's challenging in the EU, because I work with a lot of EU competent authorities and EC, and we're dealing with EU MDR now, which has made the device approval a lot more difficult in Europe. And the other thing that makes it difficult to not only create inclusion, or to make sure that we are including more diverse populations, but even just to understand how many diverse patients we are including or collect those numbers is difficult because of GDPR. In Europe, it's really difficult to require the collection of that data point, exactly which race or ethnicity each patient belongs to. We have a little bit more freedom here in the US to collect those thick data points, whereas in Europe it's a little bit difficult to require that. We can ask for it and we may or may not get it. So that's another hurdle that we have to, like a hoop that we have to jump through for Europe. The other thing is, you mentioned Latin America also. They don't have GDPR the way EU does, but they do have a more homogeneous, I wouldn't say homogeneous, but not as diverse as we have in the US, first thing. Second, a lot of Latinx people, depending on their background, their makeup, their heritage, and their ancestors, consider themselves Caucasian. I have found this over and over, and unless specifically pushed to, check that Hispanic box, that's not what they have grown up with. That's not what they have in their mind, because of what they've learned growing up, what their parents and grandparents and neighbors and friends have been talking about. And if you think anthropologically, they are Caucasian. So that difference between race and ethnicity becomes a sticking point. It's not as easy, or it's not as simple as we think. So in thinking about the world over, it makes it a lot more complicated question. I would love, oh, Karthik, here we go.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, Sophie, right? Like, I think the other thing to consider here as well is not just the regulations, but the attitudes towards collection of this data and understanding of these concepts, right? So, for example, in France, like, I believe that like there's a attitude that like we don't need to collect data on race because we believe in equality and we believe in um, secularism and all this stuff that like has driven French society to consider these concepts in a different way. And so I think there's a question of how do they think about diversity, right? We've talked about race and ethnicity, but I think there's different cleavages in some of these areas that I think need to be thought of as well. So, for example, in India, like you may not think about race and ethnicity, but you may think about like religion, or you may think about regional identity, and the language that you speak. And so, I think it's important to think about how are we including different groups on those other planes and other identity groups as well. So, just wanted to add my 2 cents there.
And I'd love to step in. So I wanted to comment, going back to Scott on other things that were being done globally. And I so wish that Alice Rathjen was on this call to really talk about globally what she's seeing and the countries that she's actually working with herself. And I think there is a huge change happening globally around data, around people educating themselves around that collective value of the data, like Eric was talking about, and sharing those collective stories, right? And so I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation as we move forward, right? Because I do see Alice has just worked a deal with, I think it's Nigeria and another country, who those patients are going to share their data, their genomic data with each other, and their locations, and mapping it on the ESRI platform that she mentions so often, and looking at, because I honestly think what we're looking at is a marketplace going forward, right? There's going to be a set value established at some point for data, and people will realize that their collective data is actually worth something, and you'll go to these broker-like kind of things, right? But that's where I see it going, and I see the clinical trial process getting easier in the future, right? Because people will be more knowledgeable about where their information is going, and being able to choose companies that they trust to market their information out there. And so I don't know. I think some interesting discussions being had, but I think there's a chance of this happening in other countries better before it happens here, just because of the political climate. And it's sad to say, but I don't know all of your thoughts, but I think we're going to have to look to other countries and their models and build from there. And I'm done. I'm Christine, my perspective.
Christine, thanks. I think it's fascinating as you're bouncing around and meeting literally thousands of individuals, how it's continuing to mature and curate some of your thinking around what's needed here. I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that a lot of what you were bringing up, and I think to Scott's point about trying to get some practical things out of this, we're recognizing that within this concept of J.E.D.I, and it's just an acronym to be able to make this conversational. But the reality is there's tremendous interdependency in between J.E.D. and I. And we're talking about inclusion today. That's our focus. But you can't have real inclusiveness without the justice of getting, transparency and compensation for the data shared. You can't have inclusion without the ability to have a diverse population involved. You can't have, inclusion without the equity piece of this, where people are feeling, and the one thread through all of this is that the people need to be feeling trust. They have to have trust in those who are engaging, as Sophie pointed out, on who's designing the trials, what is happening to that data, and why should people actually be involved. And then in the inclusion side of it, how are they going to feel like they did something good, or that they are needed and wanted and appreciated, because that comes with that inclusiveness. So it looks like I'm speaking the right speak here, but how do we get to some of that stuff? That's one of the things that is driving me crazy, because I can think of so many people who I actually know personally who would never get in a clinical trial just because they don't have trust. So I'll leave that there. This is Michael, and I'm done speaking.
Great comments, Michael. This is Edie. I wanted to tap in and say, as well, in addition to your great comments and thinking about the international perspective of this, another piece of this is understanding the different cultures that present even just within one country or one state, right? And understanding that patient population and how that community role and that community approach can be far more productive with certain communities as opposed to others, depending on where they get their information, where their trust is placed, right? And how you create a trust in that environment. You see this a lot in oncology in the United States, where they have a lot of patient navigation in the community and community outreach to better educate the communities around them where they see the most need for improvement in population and catchment area. And they work really hard at it. But admittedly, it's usually huge medical centers, right, who have funds to do that. It's not going to be your smaller organizations. And so as we're talking, I see us really circulating, just to reset a little bit since we're about halfway through, I see us circulating around education. I see us circulating around community, family involvement, right, and knowledge. And I see us circulating around what is actually explained, what that education is, not just what we all anticipate, right? Like, this is the trial, this is why you qualify, these are the interventional steps we will take, but the conversation that's happening before that, the meaningful conversation about the data dignity, the power of the trial, what you can expect, what you cannot expect. So just to recap, those are really the themes, it sounds like, that are coming out so far, and I welcome new ones in terms of how and starting to get down to some practical ideas, like Scott and I were saying, of how do we actually either create that training, proliferate that training, that awareness, right? What are other ways without mass resources available that you can still do community outreach to your patient populations of interest? And another one that I'll talk about that I just want to give a nod to, a good colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Antonio Tito. I don't think he was able to make it today, or if he's in the audience, we should pull him up on stage. Suffice to say, he always talks about in Latin America, because that's where he's from. It's where he practices all over the world, but it's where he's most familiar with and where he's personally from. He always talks about how, you can't just come in and culturally have Spanish, one version, one translation, right? Just that very consent form, that very informational study sheet, that very first set of forms that the patient sees. If you haven't truly localized, if you haven't truly done the homework to send them the message in that moment, and I think it would be extended to, like, if you were hiring staff, if you're bringing people in for the design of your research, et cetera, but being really specific and taking the time and the effort to get detailed with it so that we're sending those cues. And it's the same thing I've heard about environmental cues, like what we can do in our patient waiting rooms, what we can do in our advertising and marketing for health systems, et cetera, to show solid, trustworthy cues of a more inclusive environment. So I'll park that right there and see where folks want to take those themes. Thank you so much. This is Edie.
Edie, 100%. I totally agree with you. Thank you for summarizing our themes so far. That really helps us with the direction moving forward. I also wanted to go back to what Eric or Io was saying earlier or asking about, including patients and family members and neighbors and friends in the clinical trial process
And
and
other patients, connecting them socially is kind of,
yeah.
I think, where there's a lot of potential to amplify the success rate and or quality of life and other factors. Like even in reporting my own dietary habits, I was forgetful by virtue of the very treatment that I was undergoing. So my ability to recall things accurately for the surveys that I would go in for was helped by the fact that my partner was there. Most people who go in, especially during the pandemic, went in, didn't have that kind of privilege to be there with their partner. In fact, I had a third surgery during the pandemic, and I had to go in all alone, reduce surgical team and everything. So also thinking going forward, the technological ability to amplify some of these things. And even when I spoke to patients at the marathon fundraiser afterwards, that was the first time that I bumped into patients where everybody wasn't really kind of like a scared animal in a waiting room waiting to be called up to find out if the news is good or bad. So to remove that anxiety and put it into an app or ecosystem where people could communicate with each other and discuss the various things, although that's legally, I think, perhaps dangerous, I think it's inevitable. We see that with Facebook groups. But what if there was a way for the physicians themselves to be on a platform with the patients in a monitored setting where there is this level of trust and verification?
I love that, Eric. I
Can
think
I
that's
step
a
in there
great
really quick?
idea.
Oh, sorry. Can I step in on there? Can you guys hear me?
Absolutely, Christine.
Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about this specifically because I am a board member for an organization called the Light Collective, and Eric, I'm not sure which one you wanted to be called, but we're working to build a safer online patient community, and we're working with companies to really make sure that these ones that come up with ideas that they are actually putting that patient voice and perspective into the process. We have a saying there that it's no aggregation or no, oh my gosh, I can't even think what it is. But it's basically about don't collect our data and take things from us without including us. And so if you want to check out lightcollective.org, we're on our second grant that we just received to really build that safer platform, because it's not these companies that we're worried about as well. It's third-party companies that have access to our data. It's surveillance capitalism. It's social listening. So we want patients to share their stories, but we want to make sure that we're not leaving people in misery while everybody profits off those stories. So check out that site. But we're looking to build that safer community, and I'll leave it at that for that one.
That's
That's
amazing,
amazing,
Christine.
Christine.
This is Edie. I was just going to hop in and add, just from the regulatory and legal perspective, I'm not saying it's the easiest thing in the world, but I just put it in the group chat, IO, Eric, whichever you prefer, that don't let HIPAA and GDPR be the reason that these ideas don't move forward. There are 100% exceptions to those data privacy laws that allow for people to share data if they are properly informed, right, and have the opportunity to opt out at a later point in time, right, and know where their data is going, which I think this whole crowd agrees with all of that. That's not actually that onerous, and it's really not that unreasonable. I think it gets a bad rap out there because we say HIPAA, oh, HIPAA, oh, HIPAA, but I'm not sure how many folks actually really know what HIPAA is and isn't. And I feel like GDPR, as I've been working in it, is much the same. There's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of process and a lot of requirements there, but research is outright seen as an exception, and it's still seen as the data subject, or as I would rather say, the patient's privilege, right? So at the end of the day, if patients want to connect, there are meaningful ways to do that, and things like your idea about having a physician monitored space, so concerns about like accidentally reporting AEs on a Facebook group or something to that impact could totally be addressed and dealt with in that space. So that was it. Sorry,
Yeah,
I didn't mean to get off
thinking,
topic there.
no, that's
Thanks,
great.
Izzy.
I'm thinking of the GitHub lawsuit right now. So GitHub said, hey, you know what? All this code here that people have been putting on open source, even though there's all these complicated licenses, I think we can build an inference engine that can code anything now in the manner of, hey, Siri, code me up something or other, right? And people are taking issue with that, and so there's a lawsuit inevitably down the line. Even if I were to attempt to build this platform, it's just a matter of the kind of design decisions or choices people are willing to make. The idea of informed or elective compliance, that people are wanting to share their code, quite literally their genomes and other information, to help the human effort or look at patterns in their area. There's ways of doing that with encryption, but in general, people just have to get used to that data. I don't think going forward is sustainably protectable, because if you leave a cup at a park bench, I can lift it up and sequence it and get your genome from that, right? So there's already one avenue where, as soon as your genetic or organic material that is pertaining to your human person leaves your body, it is now discarded private property. So, and that's, I think, in the state of Florida, that was decided recently with the CEO of Marvel, of all people. So if you want to Google that story, that's crazy.
And I just
That
want
is
to chip in
absolutely
there.
wild. Uh, Thanks for sharing that.
Sorry, Michael, I didn't mean to
No.
interrupt there. I just wanted to put into play again the conversation that if we're looking at all of this and data in relation to the music industry, I will still say that my data is my song, and that if you want to play my music, there are royalties to be paid. And I think that patients and groups are educating themselves. They're learning the business model of healthcare. This will eventually get to a point we're demanding that, that if a CLIA lab takes my genome, we're asking for a raw JSON file of my raw genome going back and licensed to me. And so, I think we have to think differently as we look to the future and think about, people are going to be sharing this information and that data. And we all know how valuable groups of patients are. As more people get genetically sequenced, you're going to group people now not on a disease that's diagnosed by a doctor that might be a misdiagnosis, but on their top 10 gene mutations or clusters. And so I think we have to think a little more forward and look at the technology that's there and that's in place in that weird future precision medicine space, and see how we use that to actually help and make this, equitable and profitable for everyone. The people that we have taking the most data for, me included, are forced to live in poverty because we're dependent on a federal or on an employer-based healthcare system when a lot of us can't work. So there's some fundamental changes that need to happen. But as for legislation, like Collective, the founder took Facebook to the FTC. They put in place some stuff that was supposed to happen, and it has since to be enforced. So we are constantly snapping photos of targeted, marketed ads that should not be going to us to kind of make sure that they do enforce some of those things. So I think the legislation is good to get the conversation started. But if we're not going to enforce anything anyways, I don't know where to go from there. So I'll leave it at that. Anyone
Excellent.
else want to take it?
No, excellent, Christine. Appreciate that. Scott, I'll come back to you because I think you were riffing also around, nothing about us without us. I love that.
Yes, I'd love to. Well, I think, and again, so we have, again, this is one burning question, right? I don't know if we've actually articulated our question today, um, which is, again, and maybe we have, but maybe I missed it. But for those who have just joined, our one burning question, the OBQ, if you will, is what is one strategy that helps achieve inclusion in clinical trials, right? So the I in our J.E.D.I is inclusion. What is one strategy? So the challenge for me right now is how do you, I loved what you said earlier, Michael, trust sort of interweaves and threads its way as a fabric between all of these J.E.D.I concepts. We also have awareness and education. I mean, how many of you have friends and family members who don't know what the hell a clinical trial is, right? Or are we guinea pigs? I mean, there's awareness and education. Does that have to precede and serve as a foundation before we are able to build trust? Or does trust happen first, and then people are more open to being educated. I'd be curious of your thoughts on that, because I think that those are two huge things that don't change overnight. Earlier, I think I heard Christine, Michael, you guys have both been in Philly either now or recently. You may have heard a really interesting thing back in when we were in the depths of COVID and we were really encouraging everyone to get out and get vaccinated. You may have heard the story that they're in Philadelphia, just north of Market Street at the Philadelphia Convention Center. They set up a huge vaccination clinic for everyone to come in, and they reached out to a lot of city center Philadelphia African American populations who, rightfully so, may have not had a lot of trust around the vaccine or the government or the man or what have you. They set up this massive vaccination clinic, and to ensure everything went smoothly, the organizers thought it would be a really good idea if they brought in the Army Reserve and had actually military outside the convention center
I
with
remember that.
M16s to provide security for this. Now, if you're somebody who is maybe not educated on the vaccine, maybe you don't trust the system, maybe you're skeptical of all this, maybe we actually could reach you and coerce you to kind of come on down and give it a shot, and you walk up and you see guys with rifles there. Like, what kind of message does that send? Or is that a welcoming, inclusive environment that helps to build trust? And obviously the parallel here is COVID, vaccine, science. What am I taking? What am I putting into my body? But I think it's really translatable to like actually a clinical trial. If we can actually get to a point where an investigator actually takes the time to present that to a patient, which is like a huge if, at that point, where does this fall in terms of like education and awareness? And again, back to like slowly building trust. How do we boil some of these huge issues down into our OBQ, which is what is one strategy? So I will pause there with no answers, but just a couple
So
questions for you.
can I comment with some of the things that I heard being discussed at Reuters just this last week around just that, right? And one of the things that we talked about is getting resources to people without a brand name or logo, right? And trusted information. And can you put them at bus stops and when you're pumping your gas, have small little clips about clinical trials, right? And not about the vaccine or whatever it is, but different stories, right? I've always said that we need to reframe the idea of clinical trials, and this should not be a last-ditch option. People need to look at this as an opportunity to participate in science and to make populations better, right? People always say they become an advocate because they don't want to see someone else go through what they're going through. Well, this is a way that you can guarantee they won't go through what you go through, and not just by walking around sharing your story, but by actually participating and sharing your data in a way that will benefit people. So I think in that regards of reaching out to populations, it is like getting out there and providing accurate resources, right? Playing a role in your company of making sure that information that's getting out there is correct too, because during COVID, we've had a lot of mis and disinformation, especially in patient populations. And so, putting things out there about, clinical trials and things that aren't specifically branded to a company, but I think we need a general outreach and, nationwide. And I've approached people at all of us around that idea of this isn't something that should be brought up right now. We need to start in school systems. We need to offer clinical trials as a treatment option when you enroll in a healthcare system and really re-educate people, because people in the clinical trial space think we're doing a great job, right? And we are by their standards of what they've come from and what they've seen. But you go back out there to the general population and the patient population, and people still don't trust it. And so that's what we have to think about. And again, taking those stories of people who've been in clinical trials, making people realize that, look, you're taking Tylenol because someone went through a trial, and just reframing that idea. And I think that will help a little bit. right, to start to build that trust. But also you have hospital systems who don't talk about clinical trials either, and making sure physicians are willing to talk and incentivized in a way that they'll educate patients around clinical trials is a whole nother conversation. So,
That's what
but
I was thinking about,
go ahead.
Christine.
What
This
was
is
that?
Edie. Oh, I said that's what I was thinking about, Christine, is like
Yeah.
I'm thinking about I know a chief medical officer and I know how they break down for their hospital employed physicians, visits, values, payment, et cetera, in the billing system from what they're allowed to do and also, profit versus nonprofit hospitals and institutions. And as you were talking, it made me think of a really concrete example of usually physicians by therapeutic area, by type of visit, are essentially allotted a certain amount of time, right? Which is it's a failure in our billing system, which I could spend a whole clubhouse on. And so because they know they only have whatever X time in the room, they're trying to move things along with the patient. If we could not only in attacking that just globally as a payment value system, but also say, look, even if you're going to keep some cap on, you can't just spend 3 hours with every patient, fair enough, like things have to move along. At the same time, is there an incentivization to say, especially in organizations that are trying to promote research, look, we'll give you a little more time if you're willing to explain clinical research, you're willing to explain a trial. So I think there's an idea and discussion to be had there, Christine. This is Edie.
Thanks, Edie. I appreciate that. Sophie, I'm thinking here that in the remaining 15-20 minutes here that we've got for this topic here, I'm wondering if there's some specific aspect that we could include, make a part of those, like a boilerplate statement in every single um, uh, you know patient, in the patient um, uh, informed consent. I just wonder if there's something about that that just starts needing to be said. I'm grappling with some really practical kinds of things, but even if there was a boilerplate piece in there that pointed out the importance of inclusion in these trials, because the inclusion also not only is important from a community standpoint, but it's certainly important from a data standpoint. So, any thoughts
Absolutely.
on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we actually have to start before the informed consent because, informed consent, when we're talking about clinical trial informed consent, it usually only starts after a patient is preliminarily screened for eligibility to a trial, right? Most clinical trial professionals, coordinators, physicians, nurses, PAs, NPs, the healthcare professionals who approach patients for participation in a clinical trial don't usually approach them until after they've screened their record, at least preliminarily, to see if they're eligible for this clinical trial. So I think we have to step back even a step further and approach patients at that stage that Eric was talking about, when they're getting treatment or when they're being consulted or when they're being seen for a condition, and they don't even know that a clinical trial is an option, or what is a clinical trial? What is available in their community, in their geography? Who knows about this? Which physicians can offer this option, and who are the staff that support this physician? And what is all involved? I don't think they even know the basics. I would be willing to guess that the majority of patients don't even know that clinicaltrials.gov exists and is open to the public at large, is
Yeah,
available for
I learned about
everyone.
it when being offered the clinical trial, and I was like, "What? There was a website where I could have looked this stuff up this whole time?" Now consider adding a social layer to that because I went to Reddit, and then I went to clinical trials, and then I went somewhere else. But that journey didn't have to take something like 11 months for me. Within a month, I knew from the social network data that there was some sort of problem that I and others have like this that doesn't end well. And so I suspected within a month a self-diagnosis that I had cancer, but it took another 10 months and going through 7 doctors. And the tragedy of it is the doctors, even though I'm a biophysicist by training, thought that I was crazy and even wrote that in the notes. So there's something that can also be said about physician culture as it comes to the era of Dr. Google, because I think that's also, I understand it's overwhelming, but recently, now here's the crazy part, in Canada as of 3 weeks ago, the Public Health Authority in Ontario said, hey, please Google things before coming into the ER because things are getting a little full. So we're asking people to be a little bit more reasonable
Proactive.
with their results, but we should definitely put out a hand and say, hey, hold on a second. Here's the trusted resources from the system that you're trying to engage, because the amount of misinformation, easy for me to navigate, but even I still look at it and say, hey, hold on a second, let me read this, let me verify if this is true. It shouldn't be that difficult, but in my case, with my physicians, I brought over the research papers that pertain to my genome because I had all that information and it was a great experience. But I went to a teaching hospital where my treating team, my team of doctors, was something like 20 people. So how many
Yep.
people can afford to do that? Major
Right.
cities, perhaps, but even then, the waiting time, at least here in Canada, can sometimes be difficult with respect to just getting things done in a timely manner.
Correct. And not everyone, like you said, is in that situation at a teaching hospital in an urban area with access to a 20 person team that's going to be involved in
Yeah,
that
yeah,
care.
it's
Right?
a great lottery, like getting cancer,
Yeah.
awful lottery, having all these resources come together in this tsunami of support. Great counter to that initial bad dealing of cards for me because I'm still around. So I appreciate, I'm not knocking the system. I'm just pointing out the few areas where we could definitely do better, and that's where I'm trying to be focused and see where my efforts can go the furthest.
Excellent, Eric. I'm so glad you joined because we're now thinking of your situation and others like you and your family members and friends who are supporting you and how much education they may or may not have about even what is a clinical trial? What do we mean by inclusion? Why is it important? And how we can implement this. So I think we really have to start with, as Edie and Christine alluded to before, education at the primary level. I have family members and friends and neighbors who don't know what it is I do on a daily basis for the past 20 years, don't understand my own job, and don't really understand what a clinical trial is until we get to the point where a clinical trial is just another option for care, not whether as guinea pig or experimental or a last ditch effort. That's where we want to get to. Until we get to that, we're not going to have full inclusion. So we really have to start with education. How do we engender trust and get gain the ear of the patient who need to be educated, or the family members or friends who need to be educated, is by showing them that we are also one of them, right? Clinical trial professionals, healthcare professionals, physicians, nurses, anyone who works on clinical trials are also one of them. We're also human. We're also could be, may have been, and may will be patients, right? And we could be in the same situation too. So if we can put ourselves in their shoes and imagine what they need, and then explain in a fundamental way how clinical trials can benefit them, what their choices are before they're eligible for a clinical trial. So every patient who comes in through the ER at a hospital, or this, ideally, I would love if it was part of the protocol when a patient comes in for a consultation or a first visit with their PCP, that not only are they signing HIPAA and not only are they giving their insurance card and talking about their past medical history and signing something, but they're also getting an information sheet about the clinical trials that may be available in their local geography, what they mean, and can they be contacted if they are found eligible for any of these. It should just be part of part and parcel of our care system, our healthcare system. I would love to see us get there, and it starts with education. So I'm Sophie. I'm complete for now. I'd love to hear everyone else's last thoughts before we close the room.
Michael, did you still want me to comment on
Yes,
dynamic?
I would love for you to talk about dynamic consent because I think that that's really, two of the things that have really just come forward here are obviously the discussion about trust, but the huge issue, continuing issue of education, basic education. And so, how do you get from I'll use the vernacular that you used, Christine. How do you take a patient consent form, you know, 28 pages of whatever, which is just cover your ass, right? It's or the clinical term I use is rectus protectus. Okay, so
Well, I
the
don't
fact.
work in industry, so I'll use the other way.
Yeah, okay, but how do we get to a dynamic consent, one that does have inclusiveness in it? Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, I think again, this goes back to the education and awareness, right? And the data that people provide. When we ask for dynamic consent, what we want as patients is, like I said, going back to something like licensing the data, right? If a lab, sequences my genome, I should get that JSON file, and I should have a dynamic consent established with any company on that, where I have the ability to take that information back if I feel like you aren't doing right by me. There should be options in there for me that, this part of the agreement, yeah, I love that part of it. This part, not so much. I've participated in studies that have my data long after I will be dead. And what's the point of that, right? And so we need to have these honest and open discussions around the data. Again, the value of the collective data, because what I tell people is not one person, unless maybe you're some weird, rare unicorn case of disease, won't have enough data that's worth much, right? But if you combine 10,000 patients who have the same gene mutation and they organize that data in a way like in the stock market, and they go to like Consuli and say, here's all of my information. Can you find all of the companies that are in these spaces, or just opt in, right? And anything you find, send my way that I qualify, right? But once we establish, I think, those values and really have that dynamic consent, I don't think there will be full trust with patient communities, because there's always that opportunity to be manipulated and used. And so many people want to forget about Henrietta Lacks and what happened. But I think beyond race and color, that woman's genome continues to make billions of dollars for this industry, and her family isn't living a life of luxury, you know? And so we have to think about those things, and that consent and the ability to say, you know what, I don't want this part of this, and I'm going to take that back now. Our standard PDF just applies, right? You can't change it. Your signature's there. You're done, but it has to be a more involved way of doing that. And again, in a way that people understand. And I know legally there have to be certain phrases and these and that, but we also have to look at, when we're translating these things to patients, who is talking to them, right? And what manner are they talking to them? I've presented at clinical trial places where people who run clinical trials wouldn't participate in them themselves. And so are we coming at people with the best, approach even? So I still agree with like patient navigators that can come in, people that have been through trials, instead of somebody with a PhD that's telling you your options and saying, yeah, if you want to withdraw, you can. But, all that information is still there. So, yeah.
Well, how do you
Anyway.
remove
Sorry, how do you remove the information from a matrix, like a density matrix, which is the form of most of these machine learning algorithms? It's just a black box that has some weights adjusted. It's not clear to me how you would remove a single coordinate because for them it's a constantly evolving system, so they can remove the data point, but the network still has the weights. So unless we specify the technical nature of the request to the point of saying, I want my encoded vector removed from the system of all encoded vectors, I don't think it's going to be possible. And then even then, they
Yeah,
could
and
say,
there's some
it's not a
places
vector, it's a tensor, so.
and there's some places where people have given data well we will never be able to pull that back, right? I had friends who gave their information to sequencing.com, and I'm not sure if any of you are aware, but sequencing.com is a company that the data is sold and really, really out there in China. And so you can't get that back. There are places that you can't, but I don't know the whole technical side. I would say connect with and look up a woman named Andrea Downing, and she's the founder of the Light Collective. She is the one who brought them to there's pictures of her standing on the Supreme Court, right? And the FTC. She works closely with them around some of the things that we see, and they have the whole tech side down pat. I'm just a regular person stuck in the middle of it.
No, thank you. I'll definitely write
I'll
down
put
those.
her name in the chat.
Thank you. Very much appreciate that.
Sorry to hijack that, Michael.
No, you didn't hijack it. I think that these are all important aspects, but I think certainly, Eric, one of the things here is I think we need to get started somewhere because I know we can't, redact and pull out data that's already been given, and especially, you mentioned Henrietta Lacks. The reality is that a lot of this damage is present, it's done, it's in the system. It's what we need to be thinking about going forward, and I think that that's where all of us are trying to institute and then the main purpose of this was try to institute something practical. It's so hard to do because you've got to potentially get that legislative buy-in. So again, I go back to what the FDA has issued as draft guidance, and how do we as clinical trialists, patients, and industry people, how are we going to help that become a reality to actually do more good? So, I really appreciate everybody's input today. I'd like to suggest that Edie and Sophie and Kartik, maybe we can have some closing comments from you three in the next couple minutes here, and maybe tie a little bit of a bow around this series that we've done.
This is Edie.
Edie,
I'd love to do that.
yeah,
Yeah. I
Edie,
was
can
gonna
you go
say,
first? Thank you.
I had a closing comment. Just as we were talking, some practical ideas that came to mind for me, as well as the closing of the series. So for me, my opening comment was about education. My closing comment's gonna be education. I'm stop learning when I die mentality, and I know so many of us on this call are. And what I think would be, a bite-sized piece, and even then it would be a mouthful, that would be interesting to see if using the leverage of this group, all the various organizations we're connected to, our community, our LinkedIn family, and so forth, would be, why would it be that hard for in elementary school science, say maybe fifth grade, or if you're somewhere where like sixth or seventh is still considered a younger grade, maybe you go slightly older, you have a really simple presentation about clinical trials, whether it's a recorded video that they watch, whether you have you're in an area where there's someone who comes in and talks about it, makes it very simplistic, very straightforward, and just introduces the concept and the idea in what is considered an already safe space. You're not actually advertising for a trial at all. In fact, quite the opposite. You're just letting them know this is a part of science. And you could use things, depending on the age and when you're enforcing it, and when you're, actually rolling it out, like the pandemic, to familiarize. I know you guys probably, like me, as everyone was talking about, not having their family members and friends really know what the hell it is they do for the last, several decades, and how that has or hasn't changed with COVID. Like, that's literally, I was just in New Orleans with a whole bang of folks who are in the food and beverage industry. And when my friend would introduce me, she'd say, I don't know how to say what she does. And I would say, you know, all that COVID stuff you saw on the news, the FDA, the rules, the acronyms, what to do, should you take the vaccine, is it safe, what, you know, am I a guinea pig? And they would go, oh, yeah. And I would go, yeah, there's a lot of lawyers that do stuff in that. And I'm trying to make it safer and better for you. That's what I do. And it was like, oh, cool. And that was it, right? So we have some real world examples we can use and draw from to make this a very basic concept. And we have a place to do it. The question is, how do you ignite the idea with educators, both private and public? I actually think it would probably be a little easier with private. And how do you get support from, say, industry? I mean, why wouldn't a large pharmaceutical company, say what you will, good, bad, and ugly about them, love the idea of the introduction of trials at an educational young age, whereby they get to give back to the community, be seen as someone who's involved in you know, child education, and also reap the benefits many years down the road. So with that, I leave you with a somewhat drilled down practical idea of maybe something we could begin a conversation on in a meaningful way. And I think that really alludes to the entire series, right? We wanted, when we sat down and all digested that guidance and advice from the FDA last April and had a conversation, we very quickly realized not only did we need more than one clubhouse to cover it, right? Because we all had so much to say and so much to unpack about what they got right and what they got wrong and what they forgot, right? And so many different directions and vantage points. And we did that. We did a second one. And then we said, oh my gosh, that's really not enough, right? And so we peeled that onion back some more. And we gave comments. And then we said, look, let's start exploring the comments that we've made and the themes that we've heard in this group by actually breaking it down by topic, right? Because these are all huge topics. And frankly, each one of these J.E.D.I topics could have been a whole series in and of itself. Keeping it to one is simply because we know folks have limited time, including ourselves. But these, each and every one has really drilled down. And not only do I want to thank this community and this group for putting these on, for attending, for contributing, but I also want you to know you haven't gone unheard, right? Like you'll notice as we who are moderating and hosting the series have learned through the J.E.D.I series and through crowdsourcing comments for FDA guidance, which is just so novel and fun. We've learned how to better focus the conversations, how to better set up the conversations, how to dwindle those really long and awfully lawyerly verbose questions, right, down to something that's a little more finite and a little more practical. So we hear you and we're learning with you, not only in the subject matter, but also in how to do this in a way that is just really awesome for this community and continues the conversation for everyone who's involved in our industry. So with that, I leave you. Thank you. This is Edie. I'm complete.
Oh my gosh, Edie, I'm so excited. I'm so
I'm
excited.
sitting here going, wow. So that's
So
excellent. Excellent.
fired
Excellent.
up. Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah, we're both fired
Sophie.
up. I am so excited to hear what you had to say. One, because 100, you are so right. I think that was a great recap of everything that we've been doing since April. We're all passionate. We've all been learning. We're all changing. We're all growing. It is going somewhere. And the other reason why I'm excited is to let you know the little piece, a little tiny portion of what you're advocating, what you're suggesting, I have done recently. I wanted to share that with all of you. You may know I have two sons, and one is in high school, and they're both STEM-minded boys, and they have some once in a while they have a chance to share with their class or their grade, what their parents do. So they've done this, older child show and tell kind of thing where they take, old defibrillators and pacemakers or ablation catheters, parts and pieces from my work to school, and they show and tell and they explain how it works, and they practice with me, and then they go and present. And so I was called in to explain this a little bit more. So I presented to an entire high school of 1,000 kids what clinical trials is and the different types of clinical trials and what I do, what all the roles are, why it's important to participate, why it's not a guinea pig, what the risks and benefits of participating. And it was a uproarious applause. I couldn't believe how many kids were interested and involved and passionate. They have so many questions. I couldn't get off the stage because they were so curious and they were so interested and so smart, like smarter than we think they are. They're ready. They're ready to hear it. They're ready to understand. They're ready to learn. We don't have to wait until they're adults or earning or independent or God forbid they become patients with a chronic illness. We should not wait until then. The time is now. The time is now, when they're adolescent, when they're learning, when their brains are sponges, right? The other thing I wanted to tell you, which you probably don't know, is I am a JSHS mentor. JSHS is a Junior Science and Humanities Symposium. It is a program funded by U.S. military for STEM-minded high school students who are interested in STEM careers. So I mentor two high school students right now who are competing in the symposium next March. And they have research projects that they are conducting, and they're mostly preclinical or basic research. But because I have this background in clinical research, I always relate their project or their hypothesis or their methods back to humans. How can we relate this to human clinical research and study? And it's not only rewarding for me, but they are learning and they are talking to others and spreading this information. And why can't we do this in high schools or primary schools, middle schools across the country? Why not? And then the other thing, last thing I wanted to share was going back to what Eric was talking about and Christine was talking about from a patient perspective, family perspective, friend and caregiver perspective. Why can't we educate patients before they are eligible for a clinical trial, make it a regular part of their education? And something I constantly talk about is patient focus groups coming from the sponsor perspective or CRO perspective. We should be including patients, family members, and caregivers in the protocol design, from the design phase to the operational phase to the distribution phase to the enrollment phase. Is this design practical for patients? Are you going to be able to make these follow-up visits? Are we going to be able to talk to you about adverse events, or how this design is carried out at every level? And so I have started doing that at a small scale where I work, involving patients in our design and having those conversations at just one point right now, but I'm hoping to have multiple touch points throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial. This is something I really feel passionate about, involving them and getting their input and involvement. I hope it spreads. I really hope it spreads. I hope other sponsors and CROs start to do this. And I hope we see the value of community-based research and community outreach. So that's it. That's what I'm hoping for. And this is Sophie. I'm complete.
Sophie, that was beautiful, and certainly your grassroots efforts, I think are going to pay back big time. I'm looking for opportunities to do the same. I've been in touch with our local Carlsbad High School, kind of trying to see if I can get involved in the science day that they have, and I think that's terrific. Kartik, do you have some closing thoughts? I know you haven't been a part of this all along, but you've been so insightful to everything here, and I'd love to hear from you as the last note here before noon our time on the West Coast and 3 o'clock East Coast.
Yeah. That was all amazing, Edie, Sophie. I definitely want to connect with both of you after, because those are some amazing ideas and examples. For me, I think for this session, one thing I'm thinking about is how do we talked about education. How do we educate clinical trial professionals so that they have better nuance in engaging with patients? I hear so many stories from patients that we talk to at LeapCure who interact with the site and have such a bad experience with the site that they are not only dissuaded from participating in this clinical trial, but any clinical trial going forward. And how do we kind of turn education not just about implicit bias training or sensitivity training, but really into action about how you interact with patients. How do you kind of support patients through the clinical trial journey at the site level, and really provide that as a resource for sites. I know Daniel used to be on these calls, and I know he's a lot of thoughts on this, but I think that's something that I'm thinking about that I want to take away from this and explore further. And I think for this whole series, I want to turn it back to a comment that you made, Michael, about how the specific components of J.E.D.I are so interconnected, right? And I want to be really curious and encourage the group to be really curious about what are those intersections? How do we explore those? And how do our solutions kind of champion not just inclusion, but so many different aspects of diversity, of justice, of equity, because they are interconnected? And how do we kind of build solutions that champion multiple things going forward? And so this is Kartik. I've really enjoyed being a part of this, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everybody's contributions today. Just want to remind everybody that this Clinical Trials Clubhouse is part of a suite of rooms that is sponsored by Consuli. Consuli is a public benefit company with a mission to enable individuals to participate in the data economy and to have their clinical data, through recruitment, carefully managed, and to expedite connection with appropriate trials. We really try to make sure that we are as transparent and as adherent to the principles or the goals of J.E.D.I as possible as an organization, and certainly within our clubhouse room here. We will be getting information out to everybody about next month. We will take a look at that. I know that December is incredibly busy for a lot of people, so I will offer up that there may be a possibility that we take a break in December and move and look for a January meeting. But Edie and Sophie and Kartik and Christine will all be talking here. And from a co-moderation standpoint, I just want to thank each of you for joining today and helping me out with this. Look forward to speaking soon, and wishing everybody a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Okay. We'll see each
Thank
other
Happy
you all.
soon.
Thanksgiving.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Ciao.